I'm Charles Dickens. I wish you warm and anachronistic greetings on this, the American holiday of Thanksgiving. Due to certain circumstances with which we are all far too aware, I am unable to make my annual trip to your delightful city of Altoona to do a dramatic reading of my 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol, ably assisted by your very own Altoona Literary and Dramatic Society, or as they are also called, Miracle Productions at St. Luke's. I shall instead spend the next several weeks reading from children's stories from Dickens, adapted by his granddaughter and others. Appropriately enough, we shall begin with the adaptation of A Christmas Carol, entitled simply Tiny Tim. It will surprise you all very much to hear that there was once a man who did not like Christmas. In fact, he had been heard on several occasions to use the word humbug in regard to it. His name was Scrooge, and he was a hard, sour-tempered man of business, intent only on saving and making money and caring nothing for anyone. He paid the poor, hard-working clerk in his office as little as he could possibly get for the work done for, and lived on as little as possible himself, alone in 2 dismal rooms. He was never merry or comfortable or happy, and he hated other people to be so, and that was the reason why he hated Christmas. Because people will be happy at Christmas, you know, if they possibly can, and like to have a little money to make themselves and others comfortable. Well, it was Christmas Eve, a very cold and foggy one, and Mr. Scrooge, having given his poor clerk unwilling permission to spend Christmas Day at home, locked up his office and went home himself in a very bad temper and with a cold in his head. After having taken some gruel as he sat over a miserable fire in his dismal room, he got into his bed and had some wonderful and disagreeable dreams, in which we will leave him whilst we see how Tiny Tim, the son of his poor clerk, spent Christmas Day. The name of the clerk was Bob Cratchit. He had a wife and 5 other children besides Tim, who was a weak and delicate little cripple, and for this reason was dearly loved by his father and the rest of the family. Not but what he was a dear little boy too, gentle and patient and loving, with a sweet face of his own, which no one could help looking at. Whenever he could spare the time, it was Mr. Cratchit's delight to carry his little boy on his shoulder to see the shops and the people, and today he had taken him to church for the first time. "Whatever has got your precious father and your brother, Tiny Tim?" exclaimed Mrs. Cratchit. "Here's dinner all ready to be dished out. I've never known him to be so late on Christmas Day before." "Here he is, mother!" cried Belinda, and "Here he is!" cried the other children, as Mr. Cratchit came in, his long comforter hanging 3 feet from under his threadbare coat, for cold as it was, the poor clerk had no topcoat. Tiny Tim was perched on his father's shoulder with his little crutch in his hand. "And how did Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold, and better," replied his father. "I think, wife, this child gets thoughtful sitting at home so much. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people in church who saw he was a cripple would be pleased to remember on Christmas Day who it was who made the lame to walk." "Bless his sweet heart," said his mother in a trembling voice, and the father's voice trembling too, as he remarked, "Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty at last." Dinner was waiting to be dished out. Mrs. Cratchit proudly placed a goose upon the table. Belinda brought in the applesauce, and Peter the mashed potatoes. The other children set chairs. Tim, as usual, close to his father's, and Tim was so excited that he rapped the table with his knife and cried, "Hurrah!" After the goose came the pudding, with a great smell of steam, like washing day, as it came out of the copper. In it came, all ablaze, with its sprig of holly in the middle, and was eaten to the last morsel. Then apples and oranges were set upon the table, and shovels of chestnuts on the fire, and Mr. Cratchit served round some hot sweet stuff out of a jug as they closed round the fire and said, "Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, every one," echoed Tiny Tim, and then they drank each other's health, and Mr. Scrooge's health, and told stories and sang songs, and Tim, who had a sweet little voice, singing very well indeed, a song about a child who was lost in the snow on Christmas Day. Now I told you that Mr. Scrooge had some disagreeable and wonderful dreams on Christmas Eve, and so he had. And in one of them he dreamt that a Christmas spirit showed him his clerks home. He saw them all gathered round the fire, and heard them drink his health in Tiny Tim's song, and he took special note of Tiny Tim himself. How Scrooge spent Christmas Day we do not know. He may have remained in bed, having a cold, but on Christmas night he had more dreams, and the spirit took him again to his clerk's poor home. The mother was doing some needlework, seated by the table, and a tear dripped on it now and then, and she said, poor thing, that the work, which was black, hurt her eyes. The children sat sad and silent about the room, except Tiny Tim, who was not there. Upstairs the father, with his face hidden in his hands, sat beside a little bed on which lay a tiny figure, white and still. "My little child, my pretty little child," he sobbed, as the tears fell through his fingers onto the floor. Tiny Tim died because his father was too poor to give him what was necessary to make him well. You kept him poor, said the dream spirit to Mr. Scrooge. The father kissed the cold little face on the bed and went downstairs, where the sprays of holly still remained about the humble room, and, taking his hat, went out, with a wistful glance at the little crutch in the corner as he shut the door. Mr. Scrooge saw all this, and many more things, strange and sad. The spirit took care of that. But wonderful to relate, he woke the next morning feeling a different man, feeling as he had never felt before in his life. "Why, I'm as light as a feather, as happy as an angel, as merry as a schoolboy," he said to himself, as he absolutely skipped into the next room to breakfast, and threw on all the coals at once, and put 2 lumps of sugar in his tea. "I hope everyone had a Merry Christmas, and here's a Happy New Year to all the world." Poor Bob Cratchit crept into the office a few minutes late, expecting to be roundly abused and scolded for it. But no such thing. His master was there with his back to a good fire, and actually smiling. And as he shook hands with the clerk, telling him heartily he was going to raise his salary, and asking quite affectionately about Tiny Tim. "And mind you, make up a good fire in your room before you go to work, Bob," he said, as he closed his own door. Bob could hardly believe his eyes and ears, but it was all true. Such doings as they had on New Year's Day had never been seen before in the Cratchits' home, nor such a turkey as Mr. Scrooge sent them for dinner. Tiny Tim had his share too, for Tiny Tim did not die, not a bit of it. Mr. Scrooge was a second father to him from that day, and he wanted for nothing, and grew up strong and hearty. Mr. Scrooge loved him, and well he might, for was it not Tiny Tim who had unconsciously, through the Christmas dream spirit, touched his hard heart and caused him to become a good and happy man? Please join me next week when we shall read another adaptation of another one of my Christmas novellas.